Have you ever noticed how everything feels confusing the moment you stop reaching out, and suddenly the dynamic between you and them begins to shift? One day you were always present, always available, always responding. Then you pulled back, even slightly, and something felt different. Not just for them, but for you too. That shift can feel mysterious, almost as if distance itself carries some kind of power. But the truth is, no contact is not magic. It does not work because silence is special or because ignoring someone forces them to care. What actually happens is psychological. When someone is used to your constant presence, your replies, your attention, your effort, they begin to see it as part of their normal routine. It becomes predictable, and predictability creates comfort. For an avoidant individual, that comfort often reduces emotional urgency. When they know you will always be there is no pressure to reflect, no reason to question their behavior, and no fear of losing connection. But the moment your presence becomes uncertain, the pattern breaks. What once felt stable suddenly feels unfamiliar. This is where discomfort begins. Not dramatic panic, but subtle mental tension. They notice the silence. They feel the difference. The absence of predictable contact creates awareness that did not exist before. And awareness leads to attention. Understanding this changes how you see no contact. It is not about punishing someone. It is not about proving a point. It is about interrupting a routine that allowed your presence to be taken for granted. This process is rooted in emotional patterns, not manipulation. And once you see it this way, no contact stops being a desperate reaction and starts becoming a conscious decision to protect your energy and restore balance. Right after a breakup or emotional distance begins, it often looks like the avoidant person is completely unaffected. In fact, what many people misread as emotional strength or indifference is usually something very different. In the early stage, there is often a noticeable sense of relief. But this relief is not love disappearing, it is pressure disappearing. For avoidant individuals, emotional closeness, especially when it becomes intense or emotionally demanding, can create an internal sense of overload. Even if they care deeply, too much emotional expectation can feel heavy, almost like they are being pulled into something they are not ready to fully process. So when separation happens, the nervous system does not immediately register loss. Instead, it registers release. There is suddenly less emotional responsibility. Fewer expectations to respond, explain, reassure, or engage. The constant pressure that once existed in the connection fades. And in that space, their mind experiences what feels like calm. Not because the bond meant nothing, but because the internal tension has temporarily reduced. This is the phase where many people get confused, because from the outside, it looks like detachment. It looks like they are fine without you. It looks like they moved on easily. But in reality, this stage is not emotional closure. It is emotional relief. And relief is temporary. What most people don't understand is that the human mind doesn't process emotional loss and emotional pressure at the same speed. First comes regulation. Only later comes reflection. So while they may feel lighter initially, this does not mean the connection has no value. It simply means the weight of emotional intensity is no longer present. Over time, when the nervous system stabilizes, something begins to change. The absence of your presence starts to register differently, not as pressure anymore, but as silence. And silence has a different psychological impact. It allows memory, familiarity, and emotional imprinting to surface again. This is where the shift begins, from relief to awareness. But in the beginning phase, it is very easy to misinterpret their calm as permanent detachment. In reality, it is just the first stage of emotional processing, not the final one. Understanding this prevents you from misreading the situation, because what looks like indifference at first is often just the mind adjusting to the absence of emotional demand, not the absence of emotional value. There is a subtle turning point in every emotional disconnect, and it rarely happens all at once. It begins quietly, almost invisibly. At first, the absence feels like space, nothing more. But over time, that space starts to take shape in the mind, and something changes. Silence, which once felt normal, starts to feel unfamiliar. This is the moment most people underestimate, because when contact is consistent, the mind builds a routine around it. Messages, calls, reactions, emotional presence, all of it becomes part of an unspoken rhythm. Even if the connection was complicated, the predictability of interaction creates a kind of psychological structure. When that structure is suddenly removed, the brain does not immediately interpret it as loss. Instead, it registers disruption, and disruption creates awareness. At first, it may be subtle, a passing thought, a moment of checking the phone, a brief pause when something reminds them of you. Not strong enough to call it missing yet, but enough to break emotional autopilot. This is where curiosity begins to form, not because they suddenly realized everything, but because something familiar is no longer happening the way it used to. The absence of predictable contact changes the emotional rhythm, and when a pattern breaks, the mind naturally tries to understand why. This is not emotional attachment in its deepest form yet. It is psychological adjustment. The brain is trying to make sense of a shift in environment. What makes this stage powerful is that it does not feel emotional at first. It feels cognitive. Questions start to appear without intention. Why is it quieter? Why hasn't there been a message? Why does this feel different now? And slowly, indifference begins to fade, not because feelings suddenly intensify, but because awareness is being activated. This is the key transition point. They are no longer just living in emotional relief. They are now beginning to register the absence itself. And once absence becomes noticeable, it stops being background noise and starts becoming something the mind pays attention to. That is where curiosity deepens. Not into action yet, but into thought. And thought is always the first step toward emotional reflection. There is a deeper stage that follows curiosity, and this is where things start to shift internally in a more meaningful way. At first, the absence only created awareness. But when that absence continues without interruption, the mind stops treating it as a temporary gap and starts processing it as a new reality. This is where curiosity slowly transforms into emotional reflection. The human mind does not leave emotional experiences in isolation. It stores patterns, feelings, moments, and interactions. And when something familiar disappears, the brain begins to retrieve those stored experiences to make sense of the change. This is why memories start to surface more frequently after distance becomes consistent. Not randomly, but selectively. Moments that once felt normal now carry emotional weight. Conversations that were overlooked suddenly feel more significant. Even small interactions begin to replay in the background of their thoughts. This is not nostalgia in its pure form yet. It is the mind trying to reconnect emotional dots that no longer fit into the current reality. And this is where comparison begins. Without consciously deciding to, they start comparing the silence of the present with the presence of the past. The absence of your energy creates a contrast they cannot ignore anymore. What used to feel routine is now something they have to mentally reconstruct. And in that reconstruction, your presence starts to take shape again, not as pressure, but as memory. This is a critical shift, because memory has emotional depth. It is not just about recalling what happened, it is about how it felt when it happened. And once emotional recall becomes active, the connection begins to re-enter their awareness in a different way. They may not express it, they may not act on it, but internally, the comparison becomes unavoidable. Silence is no longer just silence. It is now measured against something that once existed. Your absence becomes something that is mentally felt, not just logically understood. And this is where emotional reflection begins to replace simple curiosity. The mind is no longer just noticing that something is missing, it is now starting to evaluate what that presence actually meant. This stage is subtle but powerful, because it marks the shift from passive awareness to internal processing. And once someone starts reflecting emotionally, the connection is no longer just in the past, it is active again in their mind. This is the stage where most people lose control of the entire situation without even realizing it. Because after silence, after distance, after emotional confusion, there often comes a moment that feels like relief, the return of contact. A message appears. A reaction comes back. A simple check-in, an unexpected reply, or even a sudden wave of attention after a long period of distance. And in that moment, everything inside you shifts. Hope returns instantly. But this is exactly where the critical mistake happens. Most people assume that returning contact means emotional change. They interpret attention as clarity and engagement as growth. But in reality, not all returns are the result of transformation. Sometimes, contact returns because curiosity is triggered again. Sometimes it returns because silence feels unfamiliar. And sometimes it returns simply because emotional distance has activated a temporary pull, not a permanent shift. The danger is reacting too quickly. When you respond immediately with the same emotional intensity as before, you reset the entire dynamic. You step back into the pattern without evaluating whether anything has actually changed. And in doing so, you often ignore one very important question. Has their behavior evolved, or has their comfort level simply shifted? Temporary attention can feel powerful. It can feel meaningful. But attention alone is not proof of emotional growth. Real growth is shown through consistency, stability, and effort over time, not sudden reappearance after silence. This is why observation becomes more important than reaction. Instead of rushing to match their energy, you begin to slow down internally. You watch patterns instead of responding to moments. You notice whether their return is consistent or conditional. You pay attention to whether they are showing real emotional responsibility or just re-entering when distance becomes uncomfortable. This pause is not about playing games, it is about clarity. Because without observation, you fall back into emotional assumption. And assumption is what keeps most people stuck in cycles they thought they had already broken. You start filling gaps with hope instead of facts. The real shift happens when you stop treating their return as an answer and start treating it as information. Not something to react to immediately, but something to understand before deciding your next step. Because in emotional dynamics, the strongest position is never the fastest reaction. It is the clearest awareness. At some point in this process, the focus has to shift away from their behavior and come back to something more important, your own consistency. Because the real transformation in no contact does not come from what the other person does. It comes from what you stop doing. When emotional reactions slow down, when chasing stops, when over-explaining fades, something important begins to develop quietly in the background: emotional discipline. This is not about pretending not to care. It is about no longer allowing your emotions to control your decisions. Instead of reacting to every thought, every memory, every urge to reach out, you begin to hold space between feeling and action. And in that space, clarity starts to grow. Alongside that, independence begins to rebuild itself, not just in routine, but in identity. You start reconnecting with parts of your life that were overshadowed by emotional focus. Your attention returns to your goals, your time, your energy. Slowly, your world expands again beyond one connection. And this is where perception begins to shift. Not because you are trying to be seen differently, but because you are no longer available in the same emotional pattern. People often underestimate this stage. They think value is created through pursuit, through effort, through proving oneself. But in reality, constant pursuit often reduces perceived value because it removes space for uncertainty. And without uncertainty, attention becomes passive. Stability, on the other hand, creates a different kind of impact. When you are no longer emotionally fluctuating around someone else, when you are not reacting, not chasing, not overextending yourself, your presence becomes more grounded. And grounded energy is noticeable, not loudly, but clearly. This is where real value begins to form, not through words, not through explanations, but through consistency of behavior. When someone no longer has access to your emotional availability on demand, they begin to register your presence differently. Not as something guaranteed, but as something structured, stable, and self-contained. And that shift is powerful. Because pursuit creates pressure, but stability creates respect. And respect is what changes perception over time. This is why no contact is not about waiting for someone else to change. It is about becoming consistent enough in your own emotional world that you are no longer shaped by inconsistency outside of it. At the end of this entire process, there is a truth that most people only understand after going through the emotional cycle fully. No contact is often misunderstood as a strategy to bring someone back. But in reality, its most powerful effect is not on them. It is on you. Because the real purpose of distance is not to create a reaction. It is to create clarity. When you step back from emotional chasing, when you stop adjusting your behavior to maintain someone else's attention, something slowly begins to shift within you. The emotional noise starts to settle. The urgency starts to fade. And for the first time in a long time, you begin to see the situation without emotional distortion. This is where real grounding begins. You start recognizing patterns you ignored before. You start understanding where your energy was overextended. You start noticing how much of your peace depended on someone else's inconsistency. And most importantly, you begin to reconnect with your own emotional center. This is the part most people miss. They focus so much on whether the other person will return that they overlook the transformation happening inside themselves. But the real success of no contact is not measured by who comes back. It is measured by who you become during the silence. Because if no contact only changes their behavior but leaves you emotionally the same, the cycle will repeat. But when it changes your awareness, your boundaries, your emotional discipline, that is when everything shifts permanently. You stop chasing validation. You stop needing immediate answers. You stop placing your emotional stability in someone else's hands. Instead, you begin to build something internal that is not dependent on external response. And from that place, even outcomes that once felt painful start to lose their control over you. Whether they return or not no longer defines your emotional state. Because your sense of worth is no longer waiting to be confirmed by someone else's presence. This is the final truth. Real no contact is not about getting them back. It is about getting yourself back. Back into clarity, back into balance, back into self-respect. And once you reach that level, the outcome becomes secondary. Because you are no longer participating in the relationship from a place of emotional lack. You are standing in a place of emotional grounding. And that is where real strength exists.